That's, oh goody.
Thank you all very much. Maybe pull on in and take your seats. I see people still arriving, so I'm going to vamp for a moment while the late arrivals trot on in. But this is a panel that I've really been looking forward to. Lisa Jackson's an old friend, or a young but long-time friend of mine. Pontchartrain Park in New Orleans, and after the storm, we really bonded because it was people like Lisa who helped rebuild the city. Yesterday, Michelle Norris and I were talking about whose gumbo recipe is the best. Michelle said she made a really good gumbo, and she knows, of course, that Lisa did, and I try to make gumbo every now and then. And so I was giving her the quiz, how much okra, you know, do you put oysters in it, whatever. Then I said to Michelle, where are you from? And she said, Minnesota. So I said, no way. So we're going to have, next year at Aspen Ideas Festival, a gumbo bake-off where Lisa and I are going to go up against Michelle and a partner of your choice.
Okay, maybe
Donna Brazil. Who's here. And Donna makes,
yeah.
she has a book, Cooking with Grease, and has got a really good gumbo recipe. But that's not why we're here. We're here to talk with the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, somebody who has both the wisdom and the political fingertip feel to help the agency in troubled times. She was a graduate of Tulane in chemical engineering. After she grew up in New Orleans, she's been Princeton and, of course, was New Jersey. I think Michelle will probably give you more. But I just want to say a couple things about her. One specific thing, which I want you all to keep in mind. We talk about grand environmental issues, but one of the most important, that's not quite as sexy or get enough attention, is the notion of coastal restoration. And that is something that affects the entire country. It gets involved with global warming, it gets involved with population, it gets involved with everything we do. And as we channel rivers and other things so that they work well for our navigation, it also means that our wetlands tend to degrade. Now, whether that's at hurricane season or because of climate change or anything else, that can be dangerous. Lisa has done something absolutely remarkable, which is after the BP oil spill, she put together an entire plan that involves some of the BP fines and everything else, and you were in Galveston just earlier in this week.
Yeah,
so from Galveston to, Miami, in a way. The entire Gulf Coast, the notion of doing that coastal restoration is unbelievably important and allowing the silt to rebuild the islands and the wetlands and the reefs and everything else so we all get protected better from storms, oil spills, any climate change thing. So you got to watch this thing. It's going to come out in September, October, and people are going to be picking apart at it. They're going to say, oh, let's use this money instead to build roller coasters up, in the middle of America to create jobs or whatever. I want you to watch that report and make sure that what Lisa's come up with for coastal restoration goes through. Now I'd like to introduce Michelle Morris after my little editorial. Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle Norris.
I feel like I pulled the best straw
Oh.
here at Aspen because I get to interview Lisa Jackson. You all know who she is. I hope that in the course of this conversation, you will learn a little bit more about how she does her job. And you'll learn a little bit more about Lisa Jackson as a person. Walter told you that she went to Tulane and Princeton. She is from New Orleans, but I know from spending time with Administrator Jackson that New Orleans never left you.
That's right.
It is still very much a part of what you do. You are not new to the EPA. You now run the agency, but you spent many years in the EPA.
16 years.
In New York. You were leading the charge for environmental health in New Jersey. And we're about to take a job as a chief of staff for Governor Corzine in New Jersey when you got a call from the Obama administration.
That's right. It was pretty remarkable. We had literally just the governor, had just announced me as chief of staff. And that was an extraordinary moment. It was the first African-American chief of staff for the state. And if any of you know John Corzine, he was proud to be able to add that to the list of reasons for doing it. And I had to walk into his office and say, I got a call today from the transition for the president-elect, and I think they want me to help. And he looked at me, and I'll never forget, he said, "You're not going to Washington." And I said, no, of course not. They just need a little help. He said, you're going to Washington. And he was right. He was right.
Tell me about the department that you inherited, the EPA that you inherited, and what you knew you had to change going in.
I think two things, well, maybe three. The first was an EPA that both inside and out, and especially inside, felt as though their voice wasn't being heard, and more importantly, that scientific information wasn't driving decision making. And probably one of the best known examples of that was every 5 years under the law, we set a standard for smog in this country. It's the Ozone Standard. Ozone is by far the biggest environmental cause of asthma, and asthma is still at epidemic proportions in our country, and especially amongst Latinos and African Americans. But actually, it's everywhere. And the scientific studies that are called for by law said set a standard between 60 and 70, and the standard had been set at 75. Another good example was mercury. The past standards for mercury and air toxic emissions from power plants had been thrown out by the court, as had another really important set of regulations to deal with interstate transport of pollution. The idea that so many people in our country live on the eastern side of the country, and about a third of the pollution that they breathe comes from sources that they can't control because it comes from the Midwest. That rule had been thrown out. So on a number of fronts, and I could talk about water as well, where the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act was very, very murky, bad pun. We had a whole slew of business to do, so we had work to do to fix and respond to court decisions, a huge backlog, but we also had a morale problem. And it was inside the agency, which I actually thought would be the easiest to cure, but outside, because the Environmental Protection Agency is sort of like the CDC. If we lose the confidence of the American people, that we're speaking truthfully to them about the challenges that we face, we really have lost most of the ability to do our job, which is to protect human health and the environment, to protect the environment and therefore keep people healthy.
When you say you had a morale problem, you mean the way that the agency was viewed outside, or a morale problem inside the agency?
Right, both. I think that the morale problem inside was employees who had worked a long time, whether it be on climate change or water issues or mercury or whatever, whose work wasn't coming to the fore. They would see rules that they had worked on go up to the third floor, which is where my office is, and be changed. And they never saw how those changes happened. So there was a transparency and integrity problem inside. But that you can fix with changes inside by management. What was harder was making sure that we didn't lose the confidence of the American people. And you know, I don't know if you've ever seen any of these polls, but poll after poll shows that EPA is a trusted agency by the American people. They believe that by and large, I mean, it's not absolutely overwhelming. There are a couple agencies that are higher, that EPA speaks with integrity, and you can't lose that, and that's what we worry about.
You came in with a 5-point plan. There were 5 things that you wanted to take on. Why don't you tell our audience what it was that you wanted to do, and then I have a follow-up question on that. Yeah,
they're not really surprising when you think of EPA, but each point had things we knew we needed to do. So I just outlined for you a number of air regulations and standards, you know, guidelines, safeguards that were due to the American people. So we had a whole clean air agenda to be strategic, but be smart about resetting those safeguards, to do what the law called for us to do, and to answer these court cases. We called them the Alice in Wonderland cases because they were so scathing in their decisions that they literally just castigated the agency for how bad these rules had been written and how they did not follow the law. So clean air was really to get us back on track. We set a separate strategy around climate, which was, you know, I came in as part of a green cabinet with the president, and we all were and continue to be devoted to the idea that there are broad strategies across our agencies that can help move us to cleaner energy and lower carbon pollution. And EPA is a big part of that, and we can certainly talk about our endangerment finding and the fact that most Americans don't realize that right now, today, we regulate carbon dioxide pollution in our country from cars, soon to be trucks, soon to be cars again, and from large industrial sources like power plants. We're just beginning that process. We talked about the Clean Water Act. The #1 environmental issue for most Americans is clean water. Most Americans can right now remember a place they went to as a child or used to take their children to or grandchildren or go to now that's been closed. either because of nutrient pollution. Somebody told me the other day, don't say nutrients, it sounds healthy, but you know, it's when you see the green lakes, toxic algae, you know, estuaries, bays outside of some of our most treasured areas. And then of course drinking water and the connection between clean water and drinking water. We also set a priority around toxic chemicals because Americans are also very concerned about the predominance of chemicals showing up in their products, in their food, and in their bodies. A study showed over 200 chemicals in the cord blood of 10 women recently. And there is a really active and really vocal sort of moms group, not only moms, but public health group around the need for this country to more squarely face chemicals and how they're regulated and managed, which is actually one of EPA's core functions. And we set a priority around what we call expanding the conversation and working for environmental justice. And that was about making sure that as the country changes, we don't continue to see environmentalists as something that it was in 1970 when people literally marched on Washington and Earth Day and caused their own government to respond to address air pollution that you could see and water pollution where we had rivers on fire, as you recall. But what environmentalism means today, what it means to a person who's in an urban environment, like I grew up. I grew up in the city of New Orleans. What it means to a person who may not be as blessed as we are today to see the beauty and the glory of the environment. How do we make sure that they understand and steward our natural environment and help us to protect it?
Did anything prepare you for, when you laid out this agenda, did anything prepare you for the political climate that you would find yourself in, with the Republicans increasingly taking on the EPA, with people calling again for the elimination of the agency, and with the changing economic climate also, in an age of economic tumult, the companies are saying, we just can't afford these standards. It's not a time for this kind of thing. If you talk about innovation on one hand, and if you talk about more regulation on the other hand, it's just too burdensome right now, given the economic changes in the country.
I don't think prepared was the word. Certainly, you know, you're in Washington, D.C., you know you're in a political environment. You know that there are elected officials, you're one but three branches of government. But what's interesting to me is the shifting nature of the sands upon which Washington are built right now. It's a moving target. I mean, things that were, I think, acceptable even 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, not to make it about any one party, are suddenly, you know, extremely shocking and extreme. I had made a career, believe it or not, out of being a pretty pragmatic person in New Jersey, which has its own share of environmental challenges. One of the things people always said about me was, she'll take any meeting, she'll talk to you, she listens, she makes a decision, she's principled. And yet the same actions through the shifting sands, through the changing lenses of Washington, are now labeled extreme. I've been called all kinds of things, and sticks and stones, but I don't think anything can prepare you because you don't know where it's going tomorrow. The line keeps moving, and it's moving in a direction that no amount of sitting and trying to be pragmatic and practical is seemingly helping to change.
Would you change the things that you laid out in your agenda, knowing what you would inherit, knowing how the political climate would change, but also knowing what would happen with the economy?
With the economy? Mm-hmm. I don't think so. I don't. I have a couple of fundamental beliefs, and they drive me. Although I listen, I do believe that the history of EPA is 40 years of showing that exactly the opposite is true. This country has had an EPA for 40 years. It's had a Clean Air Act for 40 years, a Clean Water Act for 40 years. 1980 came the Superfund laws. You know, name the law, it came around 76, 78, 80. The most recent big environmental law was really the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act. So we haven't been able to muster that. You could sort of see that changing over time. We used to come together and do big political laws and things. We haven't done that for a while. But I really do believe that what EPA, because we get criticism from the left too, we're not doing enough and we're not moving fast enough on a number of issues, has shown that you can make progress on environmental issues. Ozone levels in our country are lower than they were when we started regulating ozone, when Bill Ruckelshaus was the administrator. Water pollution is down from point sources, but up from runoff. So we now have to switch to the issues of the day. We regulate pesticides all over this country. Every single day, we register and regulate pesticides. So I believe, and in that period of time, our GDP has gone up 200+%. So when you're in a time now where we're trying to pull out of this recession, grow our economy, grow jobs, it's important to be mindful that time is helpful, that when business has certainty, they want a level playing field. What are the rules? Can I have the rules? But they also need time. And in some cases, I think where we've been able to give people some amount of flexibility has been to say, okay, here are the standards, they're coming in time. But I don't think that means you walk away from the standards, because the job I have is actually to make sure that we don't sacrifice air quality in order to get those jobs, and to make sure everybody's working with that in their mind as well.
Can you achieve some of the things that you laid out without congressional action?
Oh yeah, I think so. I absolutely think so. You know what, we all joined the president in calling for a climate bill, climate law in this country, because it's the most efficient way to deal with the issue. But if any of you are veterans of the Clean Air Wars for the Clean Air Act, or the Clean Water Wars, or any big environmental law, you know that those didn't come overnight. They didn't come because people started calling for them in one administration or another. It's almost as though finally, at some point, the country faced through its Congress the need to deal with it on a national level. I think that between EPA's actions under current statutes, so for example, we're regulating carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. Supreme Court says we can, Supreme Court says we should. We'll make progress. We certainly owe the American people clarity on the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, and it has been rewarded last week with a bill that I think passed the entire House, or at least the committee, to take away the federal jurisdiction over the setting of water quality standards. Those are discussions we have to have, but the act is very clear. I mean, the Clean Water Act as it is would have to be amended. So in some ways, it's almost the reverse question. Can we do our jobs without having the laws rolled back? Which is what the discussion in some quarters is.
And there's the discussion. Also, some people think that what the administration would almost prefer is that some of these things be achieved through congressional action, even if it falls short of the goals that you were laying out, so that it happens through the legislative body as opposed to being attached directly to your office or to the administration.
I think that might be a concern people have when it comes to climate, because I don't know if you followed the climate law and the debates that were going on, one of the things that I never agreed with was this idea that EPA was the bludgeon. Either pass a climate law or EPA is going to get you. Pass a climate law or the Clean Air Act is going to be used, and it's going to be real pandemonium. We have worked really hard to not have that be the case, but I never agreed with that characterization, because what it fundamentally does is make people go, well, maybe this Clean Air Act is the problem, and that's not a good thing. The Clean Air Act is the most cost-effective environmental statute that the American people have passed for themselves. It's our law. It has saved, by peer-reviewed estimates, it will save us $2 trillion in health care costs. $2 trillion with a T by 2020. Those are real, and that's money, but those are lives. I'm the mother of a child with asthma. That's nights not spent in the hospital hoping that child takes another breath. That's premature deaths avoided, because one of the absolute causal links to premature heart attacks and death is fine particles in the air that we breathe. We don't exactly know how they kill you, but they kill you. And so, when you talk about things like that, you shouldn't play around in a poker game. That shouldn't be the ante, is the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act is part of what it means to be American. We demand that our industries operate in a way that give us healthy air. We're not other countries, which frankly are now trying to figure out how to get back healthy air that they've sort of sacrificed. And I'm sure if any of you have traveled, you know some of those examples.
President Obama made a pledge at the Copenhagen International Climate Talks to cut U.S. Greenhouse gas emissions by 17% by 2020. Some wonder if that is a realistic goal.
Well, it's from a baseline that's, I think, from 2005 levels. It is certainly doable. It's how you get there. And there are a couple of things. First, I don't want anyone to leave here saying EPA is going to get that 17% by itself, because it's absolutely impossible. For exactly the reasons I said, most of our standards and safeguards, our regulations, when we set them, they have time periods. Some are 20 years in the future. Our regional haze, when you talk about the haze standards, are, I think 2064 is the due date for when we'll all be able to see the national parks again. That's how long they go. So it's not correct to think we're going to set a standard today at EPA, even for power plants, probably the marquee issue right now, that's going to give that kind of reduction by 2020. But it does, it's just like the ship. It does change the direction of industry. It makes them look towards when a CEO or a board of directors or company managers are making their analysis, they say, okay, well, don't forget, we have to make sure we are in compliance with the mercury standards. They'll be done in 4 years and come due. So, that's how they actually work. Now, where we can make really wonderful improvements and where we have is on the cars. We'll soon be doing it for heavy-duty vehicles, trucks. We'll soon be proposing a standard for cars for the years 2017 to 2025. Those standards are always expressed in miles per gallon because that's how we've come to think of it. Remember, EPA estimated miles per gallon. It's the fine print on every commercial. But there are also standards expressed in grams of CO2 emitted per mile. So we actually in this country are making our cars cleaner. And since the biggest sectors of greenhouse gas emissions in our country are how we get around and how we generate power, and the next one is actually refineries, that we are making progress. And we will. And those, because car standards come into effect, so by 2017, you will be making cleaner cars, but then it'll be when you buy your new car. You may not buy a car in 2017. You might buy one in 2021. So they phase in, and as you move to something like 2030, you see enormous reductions in energy use.
One of the things that happens when you join the administration, you never drive yourself. You're always in these big black SUVs, and someone else is at the wheel.
I do not have a big black SUV.
But I'm curious, what kind of car do you drive?
We have two cars. I always say it's the dichotomy of American life. We have a Toyota Prius, and we have a minivan. I think it's a Honda Odyssey. I have two kids. They're 16 and 14. So, practically, you need to be able to get 6 or 7 kids around because they're at the age now they do not travel alone. They don't want to be with me and my husband, right? We're leaving to go to vacation, and they bring friends because, God forbid, they should have to actually spend the night talking to us. But so you need the minivan, but on the other side, the Prius. And here's the good news. When I talk to my 16-year-old, who, of course, is already lobbying for the car he's going to get when he goes away to school, he loves the Chevy Volt. So it's kind of cool. Well, and that matters, because if you can't get the young people to think they're cool, the styling of them are cool, he wants a red one, of course, that's good news for us. That's very good news.
So that was a message to you, that young people are actually embracing these?
I think so, absolutely. I think, we had to get past the Hummer phase, where, and, we still have some work to do with some of our pop idols to make sure they recognize how much influence they have on sort of our culture. But 2010, Time Magazine called it the year of the electric car. They had sort of what were the big marquee items. And I do think it's true that 2010 was the year when many Americans who aren't living and breathing energy went, oh, there's an electric car. Oh, GM makes it. Oh, there was a commercial during the Super Bowl. Or I remember it was in Thanksgiving. Remember the Thank You GM commercial? I cried with Goofy commercial. I loved that commercial. But I think all those things, it was really cool because it was something I had never seen. It was our icon of American industry saying, we can do this. And, we still fight with them, and we will, and that's the way the world goes. But when we set the next set of standards, we're saying to the world that this country finally is moving more aggressively. I shouldn't say finally, is moving more aggressively than we have been in the past to make our cars efficient. And we can do it and still have cool cars that our 16-year-olds are going to ask for.
You've been at this for a long time.
Yeah.
And when you go in corporate offices, you know, people, whether they're economic forecasters or they're involved in environmental policy or they're looking at in healthcare, there are moments where something happens in a space outside Washington where you understand, okay, people are starting to change the way they think and the way that they do business. You know, reaching back to when you were working for EPA in New York to now when you're running the agency, where are those moments where you've seen change on the ground in corporate offices? When you go out and travel, you travel more than past administrators. You spend a lot of time on the ground. Where are the harbingers of change where you see those moments where people are changing the way that they process these policies and where they're thinking about this in a very different way?
Oh, that's great. Let me give some examples. They're sort of just as they come into my head. I do travel a lot, and I also have a lot of CEOs come to see me. We send out a letter early on to CEOs and ask them to come or send people to see us. Here's a couple of harbingers. I think something like 60% of Fortune 250 or Fortune 500 companies have chief sustainability officers, you know, a title that didn't exist before. Now, some of them will say to you privately, yeah, but I don't have any power because I don't make money for the company. So the question is, they don't make money by making widgets, right? But they make money by saving on energy. So your profit goes up because your costs are lower. So one of the things we have to do, and I'm really excited about this over the next year, is to find a way to help those CSOs, if they are chief sustainability officers, be a force in their company where the CEO or the board goes, oh, I like what Michelle did. She just saved the company X million in costs, therefore, you know, our dividends are higher.
So how do you help them?
Well, sustainability as the industry defines it, as the private sector defines it, is all about not just doing good for the environment, but doing it in a way that's economically sustainable. So they're looking for how much do I have to pay right now to get cost savings and what's the payoff time and what's the benefit. And we can help them show that. And we can make sure that any standards we set are aligned with helping reward the people who think that way. And that's going to change, that's going to require a mindset at EPA just as much as at companies. So now you got me off on a tangent because I want to go back to your other question. But we have a study coming out from the National Academies of Sciences this year, and it's on sustainability. Right now, EPA's work is all about stopping bad things from happening. It's a risk assessment model. We assess the risk from breathing bad air, and we say, how much would it cost to get that risk down lower? And it's all about risk management. What if our standards were based on accelerating the good things? What if? And I don't know how that would change us as an agency. It's a little scary, but because change is hard. But if you can get to that point, and it's going to take time. This is not going to happen while I'm administrator, but if we point the ship in that direction, we might find that all of a sudden the momentum just takes over, and we have a much greener economy. So there's that opportunity. So CSOs is a huge game changer. In agricultural America, I've now started to do trips out to, I went to Iowa, I went to Central Valley in California, we have a couple others planned. It's very interesting to see the young people who farm very differently or ranch very differently than their parents. And it's not entirely an issue, an age of generational, but there is a generational, maybe divide is accurate, but a very different way of thinking. Young people see stewardship as part of their job. So do their parents, but they see technology as their big assistant. They're bringing, just like young people bring technology to us, they're bringing it onto the farm. And so I think that's going to be a game changer in that field as the next generation of farmers come in. They're going to ag schools. I mean, these ag schools are doing things to manage pesticides and waste and runoff that, you know, are literally setting the standard. So we have to make sure we encourage that. We'll have disagreements and discussions, but I think that's going to be a game changer in that field, and empowering those voices to help their own sector, I think, will be very, very important, partly because of the mystique of farming and ranching in this country. It's going to have to come from within. I do think that the change in the environmental movement, if you will, to young voices. I went to hear Phaedra Ellis Lampkin speak this morning to voices that are all about engaging the community in the job and economic prosperity side of the discussion, taking the next steps from talking about green economy as a concept to putting that on the ground is going to change the demographics of the movement. And if the demographics of our movement don't change, our movement is not going to survive because the demographics of this country are changing. So it's really important that we not think about environmental protection as something that comes at the end of the process after we got mine. I got mine, now let me see what I can preserve. But I want to be part of the process of getting mine is actually because I'm helping to work in the green economy.
We're going to take questions from the audience in a minute, but I want to engage the audience in something on a topic that's very important to you. Lisa Jackson, you've talked about changing the face of environmentalism in this country. And environmental justice, the concept of environmental justice is very important to you. A little bit of word association with our audience. When you think of the word environmentalist, close your eyes and what comes to mind? What does that person look like? A tree hugger. Okay. What does that person look like?
Looks like me.
Looks like you. Woman with curly hair who's Caucasian. What does that person look like? Informed. Informed. Does that person look like someone who lives in Harlem or in inner city Detroit?
God, no.
No.
And yet, I will tell you that in my travels, I've been to Harlem and done plantings, and there are green gardens springing up all over the place. I wish Phaedra was here. Is she here? I did that one with her. She is here. Oh, she's outside. Oh, yeah. Okay, sure. Or Detroit, where you talk about Detroiters for environmental justice who are working so hard to include that in their policies. Or Jackson, Mississippi, where their biggest issue is that in the gentrification of the suburbs, they have an old and aging water system that they can't pay for because all the ratepayers left and don't want to invest in that system. So they don't have clean water and can't afford to meet their federal obligations, and so they're going bankrupt. Every single community, just like any environmentalist, every single community has somebody who looks up and goes, this shouldn't be. This lot shouldn't be vacant, contaminated, and making me sick. The air here means I was in the hospital again last night with my child. Or the water here, is not healthy. And they get angry and they get active. But in the past, the voices in that movement that came forward were big voices that talked about big things like conservation and big things like air and water quality. So I think one of our other priorities, we talk a lot about empowering communities to help make their own communities healthier. And we really, really need to be willing as an environmental movement to let those other voices be the lead sometimes. And what will happen, and this is a little scary, you will hear people say, well, I'm not sure I can embrace this environmental thing. Because what it means to them is that the environment is the only thing that matters. So you're asking me to say that I would give up my job, give up my home, whatever. I get accused all the time that we're going to start going back to walking, and none of us can have TVs, and you can't have a car because it's so bad. People think of the extreme of the environmental movement, whereas if we have a new kind of environmentalism, it is going to talk about jobs in our economy, and it is going to talk about prosperity. Because those communities know that if they don't have prosperity, they don't have anything. They can't feed their families. So it's all of that together. And we have to be willing not to see that as a threat, that somehow we're diluting the movement. We're actually making it much, much stronger, I think.
How do you make sure that the people who lead the environmental movement, as it's broadly understood, both in the nonprofits, but also in Congress, the members of Congress who come from sort of open sky states, also think about the people who live in Detroit and the people in Harlem and the younger people that are involved in the environmental movement and include their cause and their voices?
Well, one of the things I like to say about environmental justice is that the environmental justice is also, to me, about unfinished business. It is great to say that now, I don't know, let's say 60, 70% of the country meets the daily standard for ozone, except for Houston, except for LA, except for the Central Valley, except for New Jersey, so you name all these big swaths of the country that tend to be densely populated. Part of the reason for their ozone problems is they have so many cars, all that kind of thing. Well, first off, that's not fair. That's an injustice that those communities are dealing with the level of sickness and healthcare costs and all the sort of tragedy that comes with it. But second, the wind does not stay in one place. and water flows downhill. So one of the things I say to people who love their open spaces and fight to protect the rural nature of their communities, I don't want development. I love it here. I want to preserve this watershed. I think conservation is the way for me to go. Is yes, that's right. But your watershed won't be healthy if upstream we're sacrificing the watershed so we can have industry, or so we can mine, do mountaintop removal practices. See, in those valleys where we're dumping all that mountaintop removal mining, there's the beginning of really bad water quality, and by the time you get down gradient, somebody's going to have bad water. So you have to remind people that air blows and water flows downhill, and maybe realize that this is, what we did when we said we wanted a Clean Air and Clean Water Act was realize that I can't have clean air if you don't have clean air. And that's really, really important. And increasingly, with the exception of climate, there's huge regional transport issues associated with, water pollution and air pollution.
Administrator Jackson, I want to ask you about BP and the oil spill in the Gulf region. You're from Louisiana. You're a chemical engineer by training.
I am.
And so this was a catastrophe that touched you in many ways, many personal ways. Mm-hmm. And your role in the administration of this catastrophe will be examined for years and years to come. With the wisdom of time, looking back, particularly in the early weeks before it was understood that this would be with us for weeks and even months, looking back now, are there one or two things that you would do differently?
Sure. I do that constantly. I have to get outside my own head every once in a while. There are big policy things, like maybe come to a better understanding with the U.S. Coast Guard, who are our partners in cleanup. And of course, in BP, the Coast Guard was the lead because the BP spill happened offshore. So the way the law works, offshore them, onshore EPA. Establishing a better relationship with them about who might lead some of the onshore cleanup efforts. Because I think when people see an onshore spill and they see somebody responding, they assume that should be the EPA. And so I would have sat down early on with Thad Allen, who I got along with and have immense respect for, and said, hey, let us do what we do best so you can focus on what you do best. Let us take some of these areas and be the lead in cleaning up those areas. I think that would have helped a lot, and I think it would have been a better partnership. As it was, I just need to say for the record, I think the U.S. Coast Guard did a great job. So it is not in any way meant to be a knock against them, his leadership, any of the strategic decisions. But it would have been an opportunity. Second, I think, shame on us if we don't learn the lesson of we don't have right now the kind of response technology that allows us to assure people that they shouldn't worry when we use dispersants to disperse oil, for example. That was probably the piece of the response that EPA had direct control over. If at any point in that response, I really believe that dispersants were harmful to the environment to the point where if you look at weighing the whole picture, we should stop, then I could have done that. I had that authority, I think, under the Clean Water Act. We didn't test it, but we believe probably so. And Thad Allen and all the way up to the president, I think, respected that authority. I don't think we would have had to test it. I think they would have said
Can
fine.
I ask you a question there, though? Were you comfortable at one point when they were using a particular dispersant under, deep under the sea, before you really had the testing that gave you full guarantees that this was not going to be harmful to to life undersea or to people, on shore? I mean, you were sort of flying blindly for a while there, allowing the use of a dispersant that we really didn't know a lot about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the one decision that I actually do think most people wonder, well, do you wish you hadn't? I don't think so, because at the time, and this was the hardest decision, do you stop using something that NOAA, for one, as a fellow research agency, Coast Guard, certainly the industry felt would really help, would keep this oil out of the wetlands I love so much, out of the beaches that people in Alabama and Mississippi and Florida love so much. I mean, these nightmare sort of scenarios of just huge amounts of oil washing up, which we certainly had bad pictures, but imagine that same picture across the Gulf Coast, just sheets of oil. and some evidence that by injecting it, you could use less of it, which was really important to me, and be more effective. So what we did was
injecting it underwater as opposed to dropping it from the
yeah,
sky.
because you got it when it was coming out. There's a turbulent mixing zone, not to get too much engineering in there. That was the theory. And I called, we called experts. We talked to people at LSU. I talked to people at Tulane. I called one of my old professors. I sit on the board of ChemE there, and we talked about fluid flow. And there was concern, but all you can do when you just don't know because you don't have the science is either say, yes, I'll try it with monitoring, or no, we won't. And we went for, yes, we'll try it with monitoring. And I believe that was the right decision, but it was a tough one. And I believe it was the right decision because we were trying to stop something that we'll never know whether it would have happened, which is a lot more oil coming on shore in ways that would have just devastated that coastline for a lot longer period than it already has.
Are we better prepared now if the same thing, God forbid, were to happen again?
Yes, we are. We absolutely are. I don't think the President of the United States gets nearly enough credit for his courageous decisions to do a number of things. Obviously, say we're not going to drill until we understand how to cap this. I don't think there's anybody who watched that parade of, attempts by BP to stop the flow of the gusher who didn't say, gee, it seems like we ought to be able to do this before. And I think the industry has really stepped up and designed caps that they believe will work. And I haven't followed that, but I believe the experts who oversee them believe it. But dispersants are still in the mix. We are doing testing to try to develop green dispersants. And my belief is that one of the things that we can do as an agency is drive that chemistry. There must be a way to disperse oil without putting things into the system that we know are harmful to marine life. I would say one other thing, which someone pointed out to me yesterday. When we look at studies, the amount of pollution flowing out of the Mississippi River into the Gulf is not insignificant. The Mississippi River picks up all kind of pollution from publicly owned, from sewage treatment plants and runoff all the way down. And when you look at the amounts of pollution, the river dwarfs that. So what was going on here, which is sort of a fundamental piece for, I think, environmentalists, is first of all, try to do no harm, leave no footprint. Make sure that in the response, you don't make it worse. And that's what I could never get. There was some frustration with BP because they seem to feel like we should just say to people, well, this works and it helps. Be quiet. And I kept saying to them, the people of the Gulf region don't know much, but they know it sure doesn't feel good to put millions of gallons of something else in there unless you absolutely have to. So our fight turned out to be, not fight, but our challenge turned out to be day by day. How do you make sure BP doesn't, because they really believe that it was good, use more than they had to? How do you make sure that if you're going to at least minimize it, you don't maximize it? And that's hard.
You talked just now about courageous actions that President Obama has taken. There's one person who says that the administration has not been courageous enough when it comes to environmental policy and climate change. I'm talking about former Vice President Al Gore. Did you feel personally stung when he leveled that criticism at the administration? And tell me why you think he's wrong.
Personally stung, no. But that's because my personal armor is much higher than that. If compared to some of the things I've been said to my face, that's pretty mild stuff. And that's not, it's funny, but that's a mark of the lack of civility, I think, that's happening in some ways. So you can't take anything personally, and I don't think we should. I think this is obviously the cause and the passion of the Vice President Gore's life. I think what he was saying is that, and it's something that frustrates so many of us, including the President, is that there is a very well-financed effort to sow doubt in the mind of the American people about that which 99% of scientists who are experts in the field agree is happening. And, it is not unlike other issues. I mean, you look back at cigarette smoking, or look back at, there are still people today who will tell you cigarette smoking is not harmful. So there's always going to be a minority of people, voices, well-educated, smart people who disagree. But the overwhelming science is not only that the climate is changing, but it's changing faster than we thought, that we are on a bit of an acceleration. The concern is that and this is true for me as well. Oftentimes, when I speak to communities, I talk about air pollution that's much more present. It is really hard when the economy is the way it is to talk about a threat that will manifest itself in 50 years. Even though as people, as human beings, we all worry about our children and our grandchildren. It's a little hard to worry about them when you're worrying about the house you have right this second, right? So that was, to me, what I think is missing. It's not that the President of the United States doesn't get the opportunity of this moment. He went to Copenhagen. He personally engaged. He ran a campaign on the promise of clean energy for this country. And for whatever set of reasons, the electorate is coming around a little slower than we might want. They're not demanding. They're not marching on the Capitol like they did on Earth Day and demanding that their elected officials take up this challenge. They will. I absolutely believe they will. But in the meantime, what the president has done is said, well, let's do what we can do. Let's make our transportation sector cleaner. Just so far, 2 billion barrels of oil we'll never have to buy because our cars are 35.5 miles per gallon in 2016 instead of 2020. Now we're looking at another leap forward. Let's make our power sector clean. I like to use the term the usual suspects. If you want to know who the big belchers of CO2 pollution are, where are the big belchers of mercury pollution? Where are the big belchers of acid rain pollution? Where are the big belchers of smog and asthma pollution? Where are they? It's the same suspects. If we want a cleaner power sector, we can protect public health in a way that the American people will see right in front of them. And I think part of expanding the conversation on environmentalism, if I want to go and talk to people in Detroit or people in Jackson, I have to be willing to realize that their environmental priorities are the ones that are right in front of them, and that it is hard, really hard, to explain until we let people like Phaedra get those green jobs on the street, how the other piece of it, this climate piece of it, is so earth-changing as well. So I do think that the Vice President has played an incredibly important moral purpose in being that voice on climate, and we should lift that voice up. But we are also not standing still.
Should we take some questions from the audience? Let's do that. There are microphones on either side, and there's a question right here. The gentleman in blue, you were the first to raise your hand. Can you give us your name when you ask your question also?
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm Jeff Weiss from Washington, D.C., and I'm a solar developer, solar energy developer, and I'm going to offer some comments on sustainability to your chief sustainability officers, because as a developer, what I do is I give solar energy away for free. I go to my customers and I offer it to them for free, our capital and our risk, and then we charge them for the electricity that's produced. You know that model very well. We don't do it out of the goodness of our heart. We do it because we get an attractive return on investment to our investors, and our customers do it because they find it an attractive return. To the sustainability officer's perspective, we have customers who are doing it and are trumpeting to their customers that they are now sustainable and are reducing their carbon footprint, and they're finding that they're improving both what the retention and that which they're able to charge. One example, and I'd be happy to introduce this person to you, is the man that owns the BWI Hilton, where we've put solar energy. He put the solar energy in and had us do that because he thought it was a good return for him. They now have a kiosk in the entrance of the hotel talking about solar energy showing, and he said, for the first time ever, people are gathering in the lobby of the BWI Hilton, which is a business hotel that people travel through, and they're gathering there and they're talking about solar energy, and he finds that they're getting repeat customers and it's improving the performance of his hotel. So from a sustainability officer's point of view, it's not just about savings, because you're right, it's very hard to talk about savings and to get people excited, but when you start talking about customers and retention and improved profits, you really get boards' attentions.
Yeah,
Thank you for your comment.
That's a really interesting comment. Let me give you one right back, though, Jeff. I think I always say to solar, and especially solar and energy efficiency entrepreneurs like yourself, you know, you don't need an ad exec. You need a yenta. Right? You need somebody who will match you up with communities who need you most. So right now, the commercial space has that. We need a way. To me, the untapped market is mayors. mayors and local governments for whom cost is a huge driver. Their energy costs are driving them crazy, even if they don't, run a utility anymore, even if that's been privatized. If we can get that engine going in a way that's beneficial to both, I think that will sustain your sector quite well. And earlier today, Phaedra was talking about the water sector, same thing. There's a need and a match to be made there. And there's not yet the capacity, I think, in the industry to go that local, but when we get to that point, that's the engine.
I saw questions on this side. Let me take a question from this side, then I'll come back over here. Gentleman in the plaid.
My name's Leslie Dock, and I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Walmart. Hi, Lisa.
I was going to use Walmart as one of my game changers. Hi.
I should stop then. First, thank you. I wanted to make two comments, then ask a question. I think everything you've said obviously resonates quite strongly. And I think that one of the examples we like to serve as is that I don't think most people think of Walmart necessarily as either a progressive or company or necessarily as a company that wastes money. But for us, it's very clear that becoming a more sustainable company has made us a stronger company across all dimensions. So anybody who continues in that old argument of this conflict really is making an ideological argument, I believe, and not anything that's business-based or factually based. I wanted to ask you about the customer and the consumer, because I think that's the other missing element in this, in that the customer who's buying a product or interacting with a business really doesn't demonstrate any pull for these issues. And I think a lot of it is in these tough economic times. It is, as you said, it's just not a priority for them. They don't really make choices in the marketplace that help yield a more sustainable economy. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about that and the role that people could play together to help bring that engine into this effort.
Thank you. Great question.
Yeah. Well, one of the hardest questions I ever got asked in an interview was by Michelle Norris, and she asked me about free enterprise and the role of government and especially regulatory agencies. So I'm always careful because I always wish I had a do-over on that question. So maybe I'll do it here. But
I think you just had it.
It's a do-over. Because I do think at the end of the day, this is about customers choosing. And I do think that there's two things you have to get past. First off, you guys at Walmart are doing amazing things sustainably in terms of lowering your energy usage, which makes you able to sell things cheaper across the board, right? I mean, that's your model in part. And also your logistics and everything you're doing from how you get stuff and what you demand in terms of packaging, literally changing the way your suppliers and the whole supply chain work. And you're not alone, so I don't want this to be a Walmart commercial, but that is another huge game changer. So the fact that companies are doing it and see the benefit. Number two, something like 70%, I don't have the exact number in my head, I'm bad with numbers, of consumers say they will buy products that do good for people and the planet. The problem is that in the old days, those products were too expensive. And even now, today, whether it's a Prius or a car, the impression most people have is that I can do good or I can get the cheap one. And so it's going to be important over time to, I think, this is just my own answer, explain to people all the advantages, not just price. The price is coming down first, so that's going to take something off the market. All things being equal, they would go there, but then you're competing. You just got to get a really good ad firm, I guess, if you're doing that. But what other advantages are there for me besides this idea of greenness? Like a little bit more specific, please. Because this product is this way, you don't have to worry about X. BPA is a great example. No one wants BPA anymore, so people look for things that say no BPA. I remember with sunscreen, when they got to the PABA free, people actually started looking on the shelf, I want the PABA free. So I think you got to be a little more specific, not you, because you don't make the products, but manufacturers do. And then one of my absolute favorite examples, but this is just me, is pointing out things that are advantages that people don't, that have nothing to do with the planet, but that would market products very, very differently. So I was not long ago at an LED manufacturer, and they're doing extraordinary. LED is just, it's amazing, not just because of the light, but because of all the electronics and what you can do with that space. But we're sitting in the room, and it was a conference room table full of men. And we're sitting in there, the light quality was beautiful, it was wonderful in there, but what I noticed was it was cool, because I'm 49 years old and I get hot flashes. And I said, if you guys marketed these lights to women and said, put these in your bathroom and you can put on your makeup and not walk out looking like Richard Nixon on a bad day, it would matter. It would. Now, that's not really true, because I don't know a thing about advertising, but I do think there are opportunities to stop just selling the social responsibility and start selling the product. And so, I think there are opportunities for us to think about, boy, we're doing great sustainable things, but also, people buy what they want, and you got to create a demand for it. That's how marketing works.
We want to take a couple other questions, but I'm going to ask that you keep your questions to the point and sharp so we can get through a few others as well. The woman right there with the gray sweater on, and give us your name again.
I'm Claire Dewar. Will you address fracking, which seems to be in the paper a lot? I am from Texas. I see it actually as an economic engine in my particular area. I think that it's also interesting, having been in Dallas, and you see and I'm sorry, I know this was supposed to be short, but you see the cities now with these, drilling rigs right close to where people are living, versus where we used to see the gas and oil being produced more in the rural. And I'm wondering if the EPA is looking at rural versus city, even though, as you're saying, water does flow.
A couple of sort of quick questions there now for the audience that might not have been aware of this, or maybe missed the two-part series we just did on this on NPR on fracking. A glossary. Help us understand exactly what that is.
Fracking, hydraulic fracking, is a technology used to develop wells. So if you're drilling a well for oil, and most recently for natural gas, the formations are very tight. This is my chemical engineering, petroleum engineering. And what they do is they basically shove down at very high pressure fluid. And that fluid opens up those tight formations and then stays there. And then they draw it back up the well and then draw up the oil or gas. And so fracking changes the geology downhole. It's been used for decades to produce oil. The difference, I agree. Not fracking, but natural gas is an economic engine in communities that literally just a few years ago didn't have one. If you look at parts of rural Southwest Texas, all of a sudden they are literally boom towns because they now sit over shale. This is shale gas. It's very deep, can be thousands of feet in the ground, and before it wasn't, you couldn't get to it because the technology to frack it and do horizontal drilling, which is just important. So they drill and then they go this way, and then they frack. So they can get to gas pockets and oil pockets and butane that was never able to be gotten before. In fact, the energy...
It produces clean energy, but it's somewhat problematic for people who live close to where this happens.
Well, that's the question about that clean energy thing. I think that natural gas production is an incredible opportunity for our country to move, to transition to a cleaner fuel. Natural gas is less carbon intensive. It is, when you talk about conventional pollutants, the ones I mentioned before, it burns cleaner. It is an efficient fuel. It could be used for power plants, but it never had been in this country because we didn't have enough. You didn't waste your natural gas on generating power. You used coal for that. So you can see where a transition from coal to natural gas would be cleaner, more efficient, and would move us in the direction of that 2017 or 2020 goal for carbon and other pollution. So in that way, it's very good. What has to happen is it has to be produced responsibly. It has to be produced in a way that doesn't sacrifice air quality and water quality. And here are the places where I think that needs to, where it manifests itself. In order to frack, you tend to have a lot of wells in more densely than you might in the past. And so there's a lot of activity around those wells, and that has an impact on air quality. We know it already. EPA will soon be coming out with regulations to deal with the air quality around natural gas and oil production, because we have places in Wyoming now that have some pretty significant ozone issues. We are starting to be worried that whether it's in parts of Texas, there are ozone issues in Fort Worth area around the Barnett Shale, whether you go to Pennsylvania, all of a sudden you're going to have huge smog problems where you never had them before. These are rural areas, and people's health will be affected. Second is, it takes an incredible amount of water to frack a well, 1 million to 3 million gallons every well, and some wells are fracked more than once. I was in Houston, I guess Saturday, and I was at the University of Houston and met with some CEOs of oil and gas companies and some researchers. And they're doing cool stuff. They're coming up with ways to use brackish water from down in the earth to frack a well instead of fresh water, which we need to drink, right? And last but not least, fracking itself, I made, some folks mad recently because they asked me in a hearing, can you name one case where fracking has polluted water? And I said no, because the truth of the matter is the concern had been there are chemicals in that frack water. And until recently, and actually even today, companies don't have to disclose what's in those chemicals. And we at EPA are exempt from regulating them. There's an exemption in the Safe Drinking Water Act. We don't regulate them, except for diesel. And so people have been worried, well, what are you putting down that hole, and is it going to end up in my drinking water supply? The holes are much deeper than the drinking water supply. So the only way that happens is the much more common problem, which is how the well is drilled, how it's cased, how it's developed, and how it's closed. If you get a bad operator in there, somebody who's not responsible, who's not seeing how important it is to get this right, they can contaminate an aquifer, because think of a well as just it's a big open portal to anything it touches, any aquifer, any strata. And so there needs to be, I think, some standards. I believe several things are happening federally. First, at the federal level, the president has asked Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy, to commission a panel. It's led by Sue Tierney, and they are giving recommendations on how to do this natural gas development and fracking responsibly. In the meantime, EPA also has some regulatory authority. We're putting out soon guidance on what to do if you want to inject diesel as part of fracking fluids. We have a 2-year study going on. We just announced 7 case studies around the country. I think 2 are in Texas, but that's a 2-year study. We'll be coming out with standards for air pollution around natural gas and oil development. And last but not least, when all that water comes back, in some places it's put in ginormous, huge pools and sits there. And that is a source of contamination all by itself. And so we need to determine how to stop that from happening, get in front of this. Or as one of the CEOs said the other night, we need to be in front of your regulation. And I absolutely agree with that. I think natural gas production will thrive in this country unless the American people or investors come to believe that it's not going to be financially viable or it's going to hurt their health and communities. And if either one of those two happen, it'll sort of be like the problems that the nuclear industry had for a while, where nobody wanted them, and now again, people are concerned. So they need to avoid that. And the way you avoid that is by stepping up to regulation rather than running from it. And for a while there, they looked like they were running from it. I'm hoping that enlightened CEOs are coming back around.
I would like to take one more question. I think that's all we probably have time for. Woman right there with the stripes on, please. And I'm going to have to ask that you keep your question brief.
Sure. Hi, my name is Ariel Pasternak. I'm a rising senior at the University of Pennsylvania, majoring in environmental studies. So I wanted to ask you, your comment about kind of the new environmentalism really resonated with myself and a lot of my peers. And you said something along the lines of how kind of the new environmentalism is about the process of getting mine while also doing something good for the planet, not waiting to, do well successfully and then turn back and say, now what can I do well for the planet? So I was wondering if you could address to kind of high school students, college students, young professionals, like how would you go about doing this? How would you focus on the environment while kind of, doing well?
Well, first off, the answer is I'm going to let you do that. First, congratulations and well wishes, rising senior. That's awesome. I think that there's a two-front issue here. It's such a good question, so I'm actually stalling for time.
That's how
Young people always get you. First off, I think we do, part of what I'm going to be doing for the next couple of years is trying not to see our environmental laws rolled back. Because I don't care how much you think about innovation and doing it right from the beginning, there needs to be a floor. There needs to be a line, a red line that sets standards across our country and makes it clear that this is the playing field. and now we need to enforce those standards. There just is no way in a free enterprise system to make businesses price pollution except to do regulations and say, okay, it costs me if I pollute, so therefore I'm not going to pollute. That's what regulations do sort of on the economic scale. But in the meantime, what I am very hopeful for you and the generations that are coming, is that you will not buy into a couple of things that I think maybe we bought into and didn't realize, that somehow there's this competition between the environment and the economy. You can have one or the other, but it's always a compromise, and we all should move to the middle. You don't have to. And I think so much of our discourse and dialogue and so much of our lobbying that we're seeing in Washington is, I used to have a teacher who called it old stinky thinking. It's just not true, and we can show economy after economy that are doing well by not sacrificing the planet and in fact insisting on much more stringent protection of the planet. And you have to challenge that dynamic, whether it's business school, wherever you're finding it, wherever you're learning it. That's going to be the key when we move as a country from seeing it as a choice between we could be the most developed country in the world or we could be the most clean country in the world. We should and must be both. The second is that I think what we're doing right now is trying to make it so that you can get a job and do it and make money and have an economy that continues to grow a green sector, so that also ends up being really important. And last but not least, I would hope that you don't give up, because as much as I like to talk about how we all need to work together and come together, the truth of the matter is we're still probably for a while in this country going to be having to really advocate to see change come on this front, and it's going to continue. We're not going to win in this moment. We're going to win over time, and I hope and I know your education there has taught you to think more broadly about these issues. So, best wishes.
Administrator Jackson, you left us with a challenge: how to be the most developed country on this earth, but also the cleanest, and still a country that produces jobs in an environment that we should never ever take for granted.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much for your time, for your work. Thank all of you. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions, but